John 19:23. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Some say that crucifixion was started by the Assyrians. Others say the practice found its roots in Persia. The Phoenicians, who were traders, traveled about the world, are the ones that are credited with spreading the practice across the Western world. Alexander the Great introduced it at Carthage, where it seems to have been picked up by the Romans, who started using it about the time that Jesus was born. I think that's kind of significant. The Romans were great borrowers of all things. They would borrow, and then they would improve on it. They perfected and improved crucifixion as well by the time it was for Jesus to die. Crucifixion was designed to be an extremely painful and long time to die. It didn't require much work on the part of those who oversaw a crucifixion because the weight of a person's body would do all the work. Our word excruciating comes from the crucifixion, excruciating. Besides being about pain, it was also about embarrassment. It was completely public. The condemned would be suspended above the people that passed by and would often be stripped of his clothing. So he would hang there, naked and ashamed. We see the soldiers attending Jesus, dividing his clothes among them. This was actually a perquisite that the soldiers who worked in that area could have. They could keep the clothes. From the text, we learn that there were 4 soldiers. They divided into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier. Now, you might even wonder why they even needed soldiers for a crucifixion, 4 of them, because obviously the crucified person wasn't going to be going anywhere. However, they were needed because the friends of those who were crucified might try to come and take him down. So they had a strong enough force of people to keep people at bay. I'm guessing these guys were fully armed with pikes and also swords to do the job. Now, to us who have our closets filled to overflowing with clothing, enough clothes probably to last us for the rest of our lives and the life after that, it doesn't seem to make sense to us that the soldiers would actually make such a big deal out of dividing the clothing. It was a gruesome thing to take a dead man's clothes. But remember, fabrics were all handmade, painstakingly handmade, and they were expensive and nowhere near as plentiful. The clothing and fabric was a commodity back then. It was a highly respected commodity. 2 fabrics were common in those days. Obviously wool from all those sheep that lived on all the hills all over Jerusalem. They would make fine wool and coarse wool and things like that. But also linen. Linen was one of the earlier fabrics made of flax. And it was quite a difficult process to get flax from it. So flax was often the more expensive of fabrics. At the base of an average man's clothing, there would be an inner tunic, which was very much like a nightshirt that was underneath, and it was cinched together and held around the waist with a belt made of a rope or maybe a thong or something a little more substantial than that. And it would encircle all the body, and this functioned sort of like the underwear. Now, it was made out of sometimes fine wool, but more often than not, this was the one piece of linen clothing that a person has. Could you imagine what wool would be like against your skin? Fine wool is okay, but the linen itself was usually, and this would function as a person's underwear. Sometimes men would also wear a loincloth underneath this as well. On top of this was the outer tunic. This was often just a 4-cornered piece of fabric with a hole in the middle for the head and maybe holes for the arms and maybe sometimes sleeves. It could sometimes be like a poncho, sometimes be like a robe. And Jewish law required that the four corners of the robe had to have fringe or tassels on it to help them to remember the law. Jesus followed the law, and he had fringe or tassels on his outer robe. Matthew 9:20 explains, "And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment." That word fringe there is also the word for tassels. So Jesus seems to have followed that law from, I think it's Numbers 15, 37 to 38. You can read it on your own time. So, and they are, on top of all that, you had the under tunic, the inner tunic, and then an outer tunic that covered the body. That would be held together with some sort of sash or also a belt, either way. Sometimes if you wanted to get fancy, you'd get a silk sash or something that was colorful to accent. But the people in Jesus' time were not really fashionistas like we are today. Add some sort of head covering, and then sandals, and that was the typical dress of the day. The soldiers did not wish to tear the tunic because it was made out of one piece of cloth, the scripture tells us here. It's unclear which tunic they're talking about. Was it the inner tunic or the outer tunic? We don't know. It's hard to tell. John 19:24. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things. We cannot know exactly what the lots looked like that the soldiers used. They could have been a series of different length sticks. They could have been stones, flat stones like coins with markings on them. They could have been bones, but needless to say, they were some sort of dice-like randomizing thing. Casting lots was like flipping a coin. And it fulfills the prophecy from Psalm 22, verse 18. I'm going to read just a portion of that psalm. It's actually a very good psalm. Well, actually, all the psalms are pretty good, but this one, especially on the subject that we're covering right now. Psalm 22, 17b through 18. "They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." One of the early tasks of the evangelists was to show people that Jesus was a fulfillment of the Old Testament scriptures. So you will often find references like this, where the person will say, "so that the scripture would be fulfilled," to demonstrate that Jesus was actually the Word made flesh. So they took his clothes, and I really like Psalm 22 because it shows us, even better than the Gospels themselves, the shame that Jesus was feeling, the emotional stress and all of that. It really comes out of Psalm 22. So anyway, now onward. They took his clothes to make time on the cross more painful and shameful. Not only painful, but shameful, I should say. So this leads to the question, was Jesus naked when they put him on the cross? All the pictures that we've seen, and also the crucifixes that we have him wearing a loincloth. But the thing is that the artists that made these things weren't there when Jesus died. So which is it? Was Jesus totally naked, or was he at least partially clothed? People are divided. From Roman sources, it's clear that the crucifixions that they did were carried out with total nakedness. It was part of the punishment. It was part of the shame. However, the Romans were very wisely known to make concessions in those places where they conquered. Like I said before, they often allowed people to keep their local customs, because why upset them about that? You got other fish to fry. And that's the way the Romans thought. They were very, very practical about these things. They wouldn't fight the customs. Jewish people had a very strong moral code against public nakedness. In their own law, it's expressed in the Mishnah, we find that Jewish authorities had actually disagreed and argued over whether or not a person who was condemned to death should be stripped of their clothes. It could go either way. So it would depend, I think, on the prevailing opinion of the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem at that time. And it would also depend on the Romans and what they thought. Would they make a concession for Jewish modesty and the Jewish people? They just might. So a lot of things have to fall in place for this. So it could go either way. It's more strongly towards naked than towards partially clothed, but it still could go every way. But I got to tell you, I would rather that the artists portray Jesus as partially covered. I think it would be wrong and distracting if we did so otherwise.